Welcome to Reader Meet Writer Southern Edition, featuring Edward Farmer with his new book, Pale. We hope to provide some retail therapy, entertainment, and distraction during this hour. I'm Wanda with the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. And now to today's writer. Edward Farmer is a native of Memphis, Tennessee, where he journaled and cultivated stories his entire childhood. He is a graduate of Amherst College with a degree in English and psychology and recipient of the MacArthur-Leithauser Travel Award for creative writing. He currently lives and writes in Pasadena, California. Pale is his first novel. Welcome, Edward. We're so glad you're here. Please tell us all about you and your book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wanda. And thank you everyone for joining today. I just first want to thank the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance for sponsoring this event, and also every one of you for joining to hear about my new novel. I also want to thank the local bookstores for so much promotion of this event, and also for helping to provide a platform for authors like myself to come and speak to readers directly. I'm very appreciative for that. So thank you, everyone. First, to just give a little background about Pale. Pale came to me by accident, it felt like. It came to me in a dream. And it was a dream that was so vivid. I woke the next morning and I had to start writing. And I wrote 3,000 words the first day, 3,000 words the next day, and I finished the novel in a month. As the characters sprang to life, the story seemed to write itself. And I knew at that point, I said, okay, I think this is something good. And so began the process of 2 years of working to make it the best it could be. And so I'm really excited to share a little bit with everyone today. A little bit about my writing. I'm a discovery writer. So when the novel came to me as a dream, I didn't know what it was. All I knew was there was a character, and her name was Bernice, and she was a Black woman who worked for a white family, and the family treated her meanly. And that's all I knew. And I sat down and I wrote the first words of the novel, which were, "He was supposed to send for me, but never did." And from there, I asked questions. I said, who was supposed to send for you? Where are you? What's going on in your life? And as a discovery writer, I learned, as the narrator explained her story, I followed the language, I followed the story, and the novel, like I said, it just sort of wrote itself. So the premise of Pale is that in 1966, Bernice follows her brother's invitation to come work with him for a white family on a cotton plantation in Greenwood, Mississippi. When she arrives, she finds a house that's riddled with secrecy and lies, vengeance, generational curses that have existed for years. When the missus of the house starts to flirt with a young African-American farmhand, who also happens to be the son of the house servant Silva, a dangerous game is ignited that threatens the lives of everyone in the house. And we have Bernice at the center, who is trying to figure out what's going on and trying to save the lives of people around her. So that's the premise of the book. It's a wild ride. It's all about the psychology of what it means to be family, what it means to love, and also what it means to have such hate and vengeance at times. And what do you do with that? What type of person does it cause you to become? So given that small bit of background, I'd like to read a few sections from the book just to give a sense of the story and how it progresses. The first part I would like to read, it talks about the land. I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee, which I'm very proud of. I grew up right at the line, the state line of Tennessee and Mississippi. And the one thing I remember from my childhood is about the land. My father's family is from Greenwood, Mississippi, where this story takes place. And both my parents worked the cotton fields. And so I grew up loving the cotton, but also hearing their stories about the fields. So the first part I would like to read is just a little bit about the fields, and it gives you a sense of place when it comes to Pale. And just a little bit of backstory, Floyd, who is mentioned in this part, is Bernice's brother who sends for her to come work with him in Greenwood, Mississippi. Floyd knew those parts better than most, and as such, knew the good from the bad like he knew the back of his own hand, and mine too, let him tell it. Although it was late summer, it was still hot, the date on the calendar meaning nothing when it came to Mississippi and heat. The plantation went for miles in both directions. One of those places where there was nothing, then something, then nothing again for acres at a time. 90 miles from Jackson, 30 miles from the nearest interstate, tossed out there amongst the coyotes and armadillos, the cotton capital of the world, they called it. It bears a starkness that can only be said to exist in the furthest reaches of one's imagination, as one would picture hell to be if it were an actual place on this earth that one could see and feel. A wolf in sheep's clothing, Daddy would say. An aphorism that for only that reason remains a jewel. The rain dries quickly, the ground a pillowed bed, the marsh a thirsty bowl, those cotton sheets a white covering for the night, lulling so gently and quietly into my ears. Nothing ever happened except for the rain and plows, or maybe a loud truck occasionally came roaring down the street, or if they were lucky, a car passed with blaring music, but nothing stirred in the fields. This part right there, it's indicative of the South, I feel. I have a deep love for the South, and I've spoken to readers who have said that they got that sense of what the South feels like from reading the book. I remember quiet nights in Mississippi, just laying out. We were just talking about fireflies, seeing fireflies, just being surrounded by nature. And I think a lot of the book is an attempt to transport the reader to the South directly. And it's not a bad South. I had a person recently read it and say, I actually like this South. I said, I do too. So it's a quiet place. And it's only the house itself that's filled with so much anger. But the place around it is so sweet and gentle at times that I really wanted to capture that sense of place. The next part I would like to read, the story is about people who work the land and people who own the land. There's such a dichotomy between owning the land, people who have a purpose, and working the land, people who are given duties. And that's a fine line that's walked in the novel, and the struggles of both sides are explored in the novel. This idea of those who work the land and those who own land. So this next part I would like to read is a brief part between Bernice and the missus of the house. The missus as a landowner, and Bernice, someone who assists with working the land. Bernie be pleased, Miss Lula said as we sat on the front porch some days following her recovery, her eyes taking note of my repressed tears as I'd glanced at the newspaper she read and noticed the front page article, Burning. Her with her needlework and me with a basket of snap peas that I'd picked and washed, the sun burning hotter every day as summer approached in just noticeable increments over the cooler morning, drowning it slowly in shorter nights. Darn hummingbird came by and we watched it for nearly 10 minutes, Miss Lula resting her head on the cushioned part of the rocker while I sat directly on the ground with the basket to my side. Seems like every day there's something new, she said with the newspaper opened, her thoughts having careened like this for several days as we sat together on that porch. Don't make no sense. Wish they would just end it all and everything go back to normal. That's what I pray. She looked to me for confirmation that I felt the same, but Miss Lula had prayers much different than my own. Her prayers born of her circumstance and mine born from mine, as if there was a white God and a black God depending on the petitioner. And while I knew there was no need of beating your head on the same stubborn stone unless you planned on learning something from it, and that I should just smile like usual, her words still brought nothing but pain to me, as those memories of Henry and our past came to mind as swiftly as his life had likely departed, that life he'd given to me in song and time and love. I said nothing to her, my anguish bursting from the seams and running down my sides, pressured like firemen's hoses within my pursed lips. I was lost here, forever confined in today and yesterday with no future, a clear view of the trails that bus left behind as my soul swept up in the smoke from its exhaust, unseen in rearview mirrors, invisible to them like black faces on the pavement, like buoys lost at sea. I could no longer keep quiet. I knew very well that the Negro controlled almost nothing in this world, having that white hand strangled around our necks so tight, with our sights in constant view of what little we had, our toil and our souls and our God, his land, a bounty stretched in front of me, belonging only to the white man. That surge of blood coursed through my brain and caused those few cars on the road before me to burn red hot beneath the sun as it cast mirages over the fields like a sea of watery graves out amongst the cotton and peat moss, graves that ran for miles in both directions and caused the soil to sway, just like that vast ocean it mined. Those graves placed out there for the just folk, I knew, someplace my Henry most likely laid. For here, the Negro worked, his hands grown harder and his heart just the same, his hair not flowing and dainty but rough, his eyes a darkness that grew to handle the sun, and his feet a plagued callous he stood upon. Looking up from my seat of discontent, I found the missus still in her frustrated state and felt my stomach sour, my tongue water with urge to speak, and my hands tremble from that struggle to hold it all down. I could say so many things at that moment, but knew Floyd was right, and so I kept quiet, forcing those thoughts back into the depths of my mind for God's watchful eye to keep. Instead, I remembered Henry as I did each night, and his smile gave me peace. So that part right there, it's funny. It's one of the few moments in the story where the narrator actually lets her feelings show. Bernice is very much a person who likes to focus on others. She's a giver, and she focuses on the lives of those around her. But at small moments during the story, her pain comes through and her thoughts come through. And that was one of the brief moments where you're able to clearly see what it's like to be a worker in the fields and what it's like to be on the other side, to be an owner, and how it's vastly different. This final part I would like to share with you today, it's another one of my favorite parts from the story. The story, it encapsulates the Kern family who own the farm. So it's Miss Lula, the missus of the house, and Mr. Kern, who is the owner. And then also Bernice and her brother Floyd. And then Silva, who's the house servant, whose two sons, Jesse and Fletcher, come to work for the Kern family that summer as well. We see Fletcher as a young boy, and we slowly see him grow older. This is a part where he has grown older, and we see the struggles that he faces as a young African-American growing in 1966, and his mother seeing the struggles he faces and knowing that his life won't be as easy as any mother would hope. So this is a section between Fletcher and Bernice and Silva, who are at the dinner table. "I joined the rally down there too," Fletcher said. "That's the first thing he says to me when he come home," Silva spat, her words of condemnation. "All this time and he still don't know how to talk." In her eyes, that fear and fire, that anguish that only a mother knows from the emptiness of her womb and now her arms. Lord knows I had placed these thoughts far from my mind, that hearing them made it even more difficult to bear. Fletcher shrugged his shoulders. "Ain't nothing wrong with it," he said. "I see you've outgrown your britches," I said to him. "You got a larger pair of shoes and somehow think you're wiser." "Miss Burney, you don't understand," he said. "Mama did it once." Fletcher's glance in Silva's direction was stopped by her wall of reproach. His eyes lowered to the floor, yet no amount of sneaker gazing could evade Silva's stare. He was changing and she knew it. That awkward age where innocence bears a lonely pot, those vines of change hidden behind the shades of adulthood, although they would soon require a larger area to grow. Yet still he was unwise and didn't know it, stuck within that ignorance or recklessness that often sat betwixt childhood and adulthood. He looked to me and smiled daringly. "We have to," he said. "Fletcher," I chided. "Miss Burney, it's what anyone would do," he said. "Still, that's no way to walk in the door. Miss Silver worried sick about you and you come home talking like that." "But," he started. "But nothing," I said. "You've been off to the city and they missed you like crazy, and you don't even think to ask how they're doing or tell them you love them." "They know I love them," he said. "Then act like it. Your mission means nothing, son, if you don't take care of home. You take care of the people you love and the rest will fall into place." "Yes, ma'am," he finally said, still that wide-eyed boy with sticks in his hands and curiosity in his heart. That from toys to tools, that vigor had reared inside him and would eventually lead him away, just as it did every child, leaving Silver to pray like every Black mother during those times. This simple prayer saying, "Dear Master, let your grace be upon this house on this day. Teach my children to pray, Lord, and keep them in your will. Deliver them from those wicked ways and all those who would mean them harm. Save them from the hands of man and give them your peace. Grant them access to your kingdom, Lord, and allow them a full life, that they would know who and whose they are. If it be your will, let it be so." Seated beside Fletcher with her eyes already in mourning, I knew Silva prayed this prayer and that her heart sat painfully aware that the battles she'd fought now belonged to her children, and she cursed all those things that killed the dreams she had for them.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
It's time for questions. It's important you stay muted so we can all hear. In the chat option, please begin all your questions with a capital Q and name your local store if you'd like us to give them a shout out. Then we ask your question. Linda Marie, do we have a question for Edward?
We do. A fan of writing books on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, wants to know more about what you call discovery writing.
Yes. So with discovery writing, it's often called pantsing. We fly by the seat of our pants. So with discovery writing, the idea is that you follow the language, you follow the story as it emerges. So with this story, I started with a character and a place. So I knew that Bernice worked for a white family from the dream. And so from there, I asked questions. So since the first line stated he was supposed to send for me but never did, the next line had to be, who's supposed to send for you? What happened there? And so the story progressed from this idea of a person, Bernice, who's in this predicament, to constant questions and discovering as the story unfolds. I find that I plot very little because I want to be surprised. And as long as the story is honest and true, I feel that as a writer, you can tell if you've written something and you've forced it, if you've written something that's untrue. And there was a time in the book where I wrote something about 1,000 words and I came back to it the next day and I said, I don't think this is true. And I got rid of those words because those words were not true. The story has to be honest and come from a place of truth. And I find that discovery writing allows me to just follow the story and even the language of the story.
Did you always know that you would be a writer?
I always hoped I would be a writer. I journaled and wrote stories from a very young age. And I also read a lot. I give a lot of credit to my mom, who reads daily. I try to force her to watch some television and she says no. She reads a lot. And then I also was fortunate to have an aunt who I was very close to, and she worked for the Memphis library system, public library system, her entire life. And she recently retired a few years ago. So I was always surrounded by books, and I was always spending time at the library with my aunt, who made it mandatory that we come to the library and spend time there reading and participate in every summer book challenge there was. And so from a young age, I always hoped I would be a writer, and I practiced my stories. And so when I went off to Amherst College in 2001, my dream was to become a writer. And I worked really, really hard. I tell the story that my freshman year, I actually had a professor who, he told me I wasn't at the level of the other students. And I went to him and I said, how can I improve? How can I get to their level? And he informed me, he said, I'm not here to teach you. And so from that moment, I worked even harder to try to become the writer I wanted to be. And yeah, it took a lot of time. I graduated from Amherst in 2005, and my book is just now being published in 2020. So it was a long fight, but I finally arrived.
Well, we're so glad you did. Do we have
Thank
any
you.
questions, Linda Marie?
Yes, a fan of Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh, North Carolina, asks about the title. Where does that come from and what does it mean?
Yes. So Pale, the title meant a lot to me. I went back and forth with my editor and my agent to pick the best title possible. For me, Pale stood out because I thought about the characters in the story and how easily they are affected by the people around them. And in particular, Fletcher, one of the sons of the house servant Silva, how he is easily affected by those around him and how the actions of those around him impact his life. And from there, I thought about a pale color because he's often, the missus is described as being a pale person. And the idea that a pale color is able to be easily shaded by colors around him, by other colors. And so many of the characters in this book represent or reflect that pale color where the actions of others impact their lives and they are easily shaded by those around them. And so they can get very dark. And the story, as readers will see, the story can get very dark. And I think that's an example of this pale color where we can start off so innocent, even as a blank slate, and each thing a person does, each generational curse can shade us more and more and more until we're sometimes unrecognizable.
Do you have a favorite character in Pale?
Yes, I will say my favorite character in Pale is Fletcher. I loved Fletcher from the moment he arrived on the scene because I didn't know Fletcher was going to show. So the story was progressing, and then all of a sudden, Fletcher and Jesse arrived to the farm, and I said, okay, they've arrived to the farm. From the initial descriptions of Jesse and Fletcher, Fletcher stood out to me. And there was an innocence about Fletcher that was very intriguing because the house where the story takes place is so dark. It can be very dark, and there's a lot of anger and bitterness in the house. And there was this young, innocent boy arriving to the farm to help as a cotton picker. And I was very curious to see what will happen to a young, innocent boy who arrives to a farm that is filled with so much anger and bitterness. And so as I started to write Fletcher and see his story progress, some of his thoughts were very interesting to me. He always had questions that reminded me of the innocence of childhood, where we are just so wide-eyed and we want to know everything. And it's hard to see his story progress because we know that, as the title states, this pale color can take on so many colors. And so as I watched his story unfold, he was definitely my favorite. And he was my favorite to write as well.
Mm-hmm. A fan of a Malaprop's bookstore in Asheville, North Carolina, asks, what current and past writers inspire you?
Yes. So I love James Baldwin. I could gush over James Baldwin for days. I feel like I speak a lot about James Baldwin. I was actually just speaking to my aunt, the one who worked at the Memphis Public Library. I was speaking to her this weekend and speaking about James Baldwin and how much his writing made me want to be a writer. Reading James Baldwin at a young age, it didn't all sink in, but as I read it as an adult, his stories and the way he describes the Black experience really resonated within me. And I didn't want to replicate that experience. I wanted to tell my own experience. And my experiences growing up in Tennessee, being in Mississippi most days, you know, I really wanted to tell the stories I knew, but his boldness to tell stories the way he told them allowed me to feel that I could have that same boldness. And I credit so much to him, not for my style, but for the boldness he had to tell these stories. And then current writers, I tell you, I'm currently reading They're There by Tommy Orange. I missed being able to see him speak last year in Los Angeles at the Festival of Books. And I still regret that moment, but I'm currently loving that book. I try to read as much as I can, as much fiction as I can, because when I'm writing, I don't get a chance to read. So when I'm not writing, I'm trying to grab every book that I can. And so that's definitely a book that I'm enjoying at this time.
Mm-hmm. A fan of Copperfish Books asks how your heritage and faith influence your writing, and also your perspective on how African Americans are being treated now during the pandemic.
Yes, yes. So growing up in the South, especially in Memphis, right at the state line of Mississippi, place was a big part of the story for me. And not only place, but my family's connection to the land, because we don't own land, but we work the land. And so my mom and dad's, their stories of being in the fields, just that sense of our heritage as African Americans in the South. I knew we had a rich story and a rich legacy, and I wanted to tell that story. And I wanted to tell it in a way that was fair to both sides. I'm always trying to, if someone tells me that your book is honest and it's true and it's fair, I feel so appreciative. That's the best compliment. And so being an African American in the South, I really wanted to tell a story of the African American experience, and also a search for identity, because I think finding your identity when exposed to so much, it can be very difficult and challenging. As far as my faith, I grew up in the church, and I'm still in the church. And that played a big part in the story, because the story, there are definitely characters in the story who believe in God and they believe in Jesus Christ. However, there are characters who may believe that, but they believe it in a different way. And I think the novel tries to, it doesn't demonize anyone for their beliefs or how they interpret religion, which I think is so important, because that can be so divisive, and religion can be such a divisive thing. However, I wanted to write a story that showed the perspective of different people. And so as I read in the excerpt, you know, the missus of the house is praying to God for circumstances to happen that would do harm to others. And so it's about understanding her faith and why what would lead her to pray for others to have situations that would harm them. And I think all of that sort of comes together, and it strikes a chord, especially now during these challenging times of the pandemic, because I think we're all struggling. I think we all are searching for something. And this is a book with characters who are searching for something to hold on to. I've explained to people that this has been the first time in my life where all of my friends and family were experiencing challenging times at once. I'm used to one friend is struggling and I can talk them through it, or they can talk me through it. But this was the first time in my life where everyone was dealing with hardships at the exact same time. So I knew that every single call I received was us problem solving, us trying to figure it out, someone losing a job, someone's family member being sick. It was all happening at once. And so it's so funny because this is a novel that deals with a lot of struggle, but I think it's a good novel because it's a good novel to read right now, because we're all trying to process it. And so this novel is a novel of people who are trying to process hard times.
Mhm. Have any responses to Pale surprised you?
I think one response surprised me. It was from my mom, which made me laugh. She said it was funny. It was comical. And I said, "Mom, what was funny about this book?" And so she then painstakingly went through each funny part that she had noted, and what it was the language of the book. It's the characters when they speak, the way they would word something. And so she had to explain to me. She said, "I'm not saying that someone experiencing hardships is funny." She said, "But often the way the characters will describe what they're going through, or the words they choose to use, how they express themselves, she found it funny, and she was able to find humor in their experiences while still appreciating the experiences." And I think the other thing that surprised me was I was very pleased when a reader told me that the story was very psychological for them. And they said on a level where the land almost became a character. And so I started to think about it, and I said, "You're right." I said, the land is a character in and of itself, because the land plays such a big part in the story. And so that part surprised me. And it was an interesting conversation to speak about the psychological aspects of the story and how it gets to the point where the land is even a part of the story and a character in and of itself, and can bring harm to those around it.
A fellow Blackstone author is in the crowd,
Oh, nice.
and they are also a fan of New Dominion Bookshop in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Nice.
And they wondered, in your discovery writing, have any of your characters disappointed or horrified you to the point that it was difficult to write their stories?
I think, so the missus in the story is, I guess, some people have called her a villain. Some of her actions surprised me. As I was writing, I was really trying to understand that psychological aspect of what is her motivation, what is her end goal, what is she trying to achieve by doing such harm to those around her. However, the person who really surprised me was Silva, because Silva is a house servant just like Bernice, the narrator. However, they're very different. Both are African-American women, very strong African-American women, but they approach situations very differently. And Silva at times would have an approach that was so different from Bernice's. And as a discovery writer, I keep saying that I didn't know which one would win out. I didn't know. So I'm writing the story, following the language, following what Bernice has to say. And it was just very interesting to me, Silva, who is so strong and so determined to keep her family intact and not see any harm come to her boys, to see some of her actions and wonder if she would actually follow through with some of her plans to save her family. So even though the missus was very, she did some very evil things in the book, Silva's responses surprised me the most.
Are you in the process of writing another novel?
Yes, I'm so happy to be working on a second novel. The good thing about finishing this first novel was that it gave me the confidence and the know-how to see I can do this. For so long, it was, I had a lot of doubt as to whether I could put so many words together and whether it would be good, whether the story would be good, whether anyone would want to read it. So much so that when I signed with my agent, I asked her, I said, even after she had signed and we had this great long lunch, at the end of the lunch, I said, "Do you really think that someone's going to buy this?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "I love this story." She said, "It needs to be told." And that made me feel really good because I felt the same way. Mm-hmm. For so long, I had lived with these characters in my head, and I kept telling myself, I'm crazy because I'm walking around with these imaginary people in my head and no one else knows they exist. And then once I signed with my agent, they became real because someone else knew they existed. And so now I am very pleased to be working on, to be at the very end and be at the revision stage with my agent of my next novel, which takes place in West Memphis, Arkansas, which I'm really excited about because I'm getting closer and closer to a story that takes place in Memphis. So I've gone from Greenwood to West Memphis, Arkansas, which is just over the river in Arkansas, West Memphis, Arkansas. And now, hopefully, we'll get to Memphis very soon.
How is your creative and writing life going during the pandemic?
So I think actually it's been very nice that things are quiet. So I don't have as many distractions. I am in the house and I'm working from home. So I'm able to be at home. I'm able to write. I'm able to focus. And I think the thing that stops most writers from writing is that friends, everyone, we all have friends and they say, let's go do this, let's do that. And it kills the writing momentum and you don't want to always have to say no. And so even though it's been difficult to watch the news, to see everything that's going on, it has been an escape to be able to write and to be able to focus on a story that's completely different, takes place in a completely different time. And honestly, for those hours that I'm writing, to pretend as if the pandemic does not exist and that people are not sick. And so that's been really, really nice.
How did you meet your agent?
Yes. So Annie Bumpke is my wonderful agent. And I came across Annie. It's so funny. The novel was an accident. I describe it as an accident and it wasn't. It's so funny. I came across Annie by accident and she wasn't. She was actually the best agent I could have ever signed with. So I had tried for 2 years after writing the novel in 30 days, 1 month. For 2 years, I revised the novel and I worked towards getting a literary agent. And I dealt with a lot of rejection. And I always tell the story that for every no I received, I had a saying. I had to say thank you. I had to say thank you that that wasn't the right person and that I would be connected to the right person who would represent my book and love my book. And so I went through 95 agents and 95 agents, 95 no's to get to Annie, who read it. And she called me. I was on a walk to the vitamin store. And so I was at the vitamin store and my phone rings and it was an area code I didn't know. I said, oh, okay, I'm gonna try it. Let's see who this is. And it was Annie. And we had a great long conversation about the characters and she understood the book. She understood what I was trying to get. And so it's been the best partnership possible.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, 95 no's.
You have mentioned writers that you loved. Is there any genre writing that you like, that you enjoy?
I read a lot of mostly literary fiction. I read tons of literary fiction. I love books from the past. And so I listen to lots of audiobooks from older literary fiction at night as I fall asleep, hoping it'll seep in and I'll become this great writer. And then during the daytime, I do read a lot of literary fiction. I also love memoirs. And so I read lots of memoirs because I want to see the person's story. I want to know what they went through. And memoirs are usually so targeted. It's not an autobiography. It's about a specific idea or issue. And so I found myself reading lots of literary fiction and lots of memoirs.
Mm-hmm.
Linda Marie, we have time for one more question.
Okay. The cover of your book is really beautiful. Were you involved in the cover design?
Can you hold
Thank
it up
you.
a little bit higher? Yeah.
So yes, I loved the cover. I fell in love with the cover. So um, Blackstone Publishing has actually been really great to me, and they allowed me to be a part of the cover. So the cover designer reached out to me and said, I read your book, I loved it. If you could give me some thoughts as to what you feel that your cover should have or represent. And I never want to step in the way of the creative process. So I told her, just go for it. Just know that I like simple things. And so I was actually on vacation and I didn't have good reception. And I checked my email and there were 4 different mock-ups. And this design stood out. It was amazing. Yes. And so I immediately showed it to my friend, which I don't know if I was supposed to, but I showed a friend the cover. And then I immediately emailed my agent and I said, I think I know which one I love. Which one do you love? And she chose that one as well. And so I immediately emailed the cover designer and I said, we have a winner. Everyone loves it and it's amazing.
Mhm.
That is great. Thank you, Edward, and thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. And if you enjoyed it as much as I did, let your bookstore know by ordering Ed's book from them. Be in touch with your bookstore with any suggestions or ideas for how this could have been better for you. And order Pale from them. And for more, plan to join Edward in conversation with the Dock Bookshop, the largest African-American owned full-service bookstore in Dallas-Fort Worth, this Saturday, May 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time at docradiolive.com. This is Wanda signing off.